Great. I'm now writing the full storytelling script for Part 1, A Quiet Man, a Loyal Dog, and a Loud Stranger, based on your detailed prompt and constraints. It was the kind of morning that Pine Valley was known for. The air had that crisp pine-sweet scent that only came from mountain towns, where the trees outnumbered the people, and the coffee was always hot by 7. A few clouds hovered low in the sky, soft and slow like they had nowhere else to be, just like the people here. Chuck Norris stepped out of his small cabin just past sunrise, boots crunching on gravel, a flannel shirt neatly tucked in, and a hat in hand. He looked over the valley stretching out below. Max, his golden retriever, trotted by his side tail, swaying like a calm pendulum. Max was always ready for a walk, a ride, or a sit on the porch. Mostly, though, ready just to be near Chuck. They rode into town together in Chuck's old Ford pickup. The kind of truck with more history than horsepower, but it still ran smoothly. The bench seat had an indent shaped exactly like Max. The dog sat proudly, head out the window, fur brushing the breeze like he was king of the road. By the time they got to the weekly farmers' market, Main Street had already filled up with small booths and familiar faces. There were old women with tables full of jam ranchers, with coolers of eggs, and kids chasing each other around picnic benches, like it was summer, even though it wasn't. Chuck parked in his usual spot near the hardware store. Max jumped out and trotted to his favorite place under the old oak tree that gave shade over the market's edge. People waved to Chuck. He nodded quietly and easily, the kind of nod that said more than a whole conversation. He'd lived here nearly 15 years now, long enough for folks to trust him, but still a mystery to some. All they knew for sure was that he was a veteran. He lived alone, and he didn't tolerate nonsense. The sun moved a little higher. The market bustled with polite noise. Laughter produced baskets clinking, someone strumming a banjo near the cider stand. Max dozed under the oak eyes, half-lidded, but alert in the way good dogs always are. His ears flicked every now and then when someone got too close, or a squirrel rustled the grass. Chuck stepped into the hardware store to talk with Jerry, the owner, about a replacement valve for his water heater. They spoke in that unhurried way of older men who measure time in jobs, not minutes. Jerry mentioned his grandson's baseball game. Chuck smiled just a bit and asked who won. Outside, life went on like it always did, and then came the noise. A low rumble, at first like distant thunder, but with no rain in the forecast. The sound grew louder until it filled the market like smoke dense and invasive. Heads turned toward the road. A big, black motorcycle roared into the square, the kind with chrome loud enough to make babies cry and grandmothers curse under their breath. Rico Martez rode like he owned the place. He wore a black, sleeveless leather vestums tattooed with skulls and knives, boots coated in road grime, and eyes hidden behind red-mirrored shades. He wasn't from around here. That much was clear the moment he cut the engine, and silence returned with a pressure you could feel in your chest. Max stood up slowly under the tree-tail wagon once, then still. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He just stared alert and curious. Rico slid off his bike and looked around like he'd just stepped into a ghost town. A few folks kept talking, trying not to stare. Most just went quiet. The man's eyes landed on Max. He narrowed them, then sneered. "What's with the mutt?" Max tilted his head. Rico took a step closer. A few apples rolled off a nearby cart. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered. Rico turned fully toward Max. He took another step. Then he raised one boot and, without warning, kicked. There was a dull thud, followed by a sharp yelp. Max stumbled sideways into a bench tail tucked body low. He tried to crawl back under the tree but couldn't. The bench scraped loudly as he slumped against it. Gasps filled the air like a gust of wind. The banjo stopped playing. Someone dropped a bag of potatoes. Nobody moved. And then the hardware store door creaked open. Chuck stepped out holding a small white box in one hand. He paused as the scene settled into his line of sight. His eyes dropped to the bench where Max was lying, awkwardly, his sides heaving. The dog gave a weak whine. Chuck moved in 2 steps and crouched beside him. His hands were slow practiced checking the ribs and the hip, the way a soldier checks a wounded comrade without showing fear. Max looked up at him with those wide, honest eyes. Chuck gave one firm nod. He didn't say a word, not yet. The market was silent. Chuck stood. The man in black was already walking toward the soda machine near the post office kiosk, chewing gum like he hadn't just done something cruel and cowardly. Chuck didn't rush, he just walked. The kind of walk where each footstep tells you this isn't over. Not even close. Rico glanced sideways as Chuck approached, one hand resting on the machine. "You got a problem." "Old man," Chuck didn't answer. He stopped a few feet away, squarely between Rico and the dog. "That's your mutt." Chuck's voice was calm, quiet, but it didn't waver. "You kicked my dog." Rico shrugged. "The thing barked at me." Chuck took 1 step closer. "You got 5 seconds to apologize." Rico raised his eyebrows and smiled like he'd just been told a bedtime story. He turned slightly and looked around at the frozen crowd. "You serious?" Chuck didn't blink. 5. Rico's smile widened. 4. He chuckled. 3. Someone whispered from behind a stall. 2. Rico leaned forward a little. 1. And that was it. There was no warning, no warm-up. Just one flash of motion as Chuck's fist drove straight into Rico's chest with the kind of precision you only earn from years of knowing how and when to hit. Rico flew backward, limbs flailing, landing hard in a pile of fresh produce. The crates splintered. Apples rolled across the pavement. Max raised his head slightly. Chuck didn't look at the damage. He turned back to the bench, crouched again. One hand on Max's ear, rubbing it gently. The dog licked his fingers. People began to exhale. Someone clapped once, but no one joined in. Not yet. Chuck stood again, slower this time. He looked down at Rico, who was trying to pull himself upright with an elbow planted in a puddle of applesauce. "This isn't over," the man wheezed. Chuck looked back at Max, then toward the crowd. His sunglasses still rested on his face, but you could feel the weight behind them. "I didn't start it." And then he knelt again, right there in the dust beside his dog. Hand steady, voice low. "We're going to fix you up, buddy. Then, maybe, I'll fix something else." The farmer's market didn't return to normal that day. The laughter didn't come back, but something else arrived. Something older than fear, something stronger than noise. And it sat quietly in Chuck Norris's silence. Not anger, not pride. Just a promise. A quiet man, a loyal dog, and a stranger who had no idea what he'd just stepped into. The market was still holding its breath. Chuck stood over Max with one hand resting lightly on the dog's head, the other clenched loosely at his side. His fingers brushed over Max's fur, feeling the shallow rise and fall of the dog's chest. Max's breath was fast, not panicked but hurting. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't move right away. He was measuring the moment. Behind him the air was heavy. The town was watching, caught in a silence that felt bigger than the man, the dog, or even the day itself. The kind of silence that only happens when something right has just been broken in front of everyone. Chuck stood up slowly. Not stiff, not theatrical. Just being steady like Rishi was a decision he made from the inside out. He turned toward Rico, who now stood by the soda machine popping a piece of gum in his mouth like nothing had happened. Rico hadn't seen the look yet. He didn't feel it. Not yet. Chuck took a single step forward. The crowd didn't speak, but some leaned in. Others held their breath and didn't know it. Chuck's boots tapped lightly on the pavement as he crossed the few yards between the tree and the vending machine. No rush, no need. Time had started to behave differently now. Rico finally looked up when Chuck got close. He smirked, squinting behind his mirrored sunglasses. There was a twitch in his jaw, but it wasn't fear. It was arrogance. He chewed louder. Chuck stopped just shy of arm's reach. "You kicked my dog." The words landed like stones in water. Simple, heavy, perfectly placed. Rico lifted one eyebrow. "What, you kicked my dog?" Rico laughed short and smug. "That mutt barked at me." Chuck didn't answer. Instead, he said it, "You've got 5 seconds to apologize." It wasn't a threat. It was just a statement, like a man reading a clock. Rico blinked and shook his head. "You serious?" Chuck's voice didn't change. 5. The number floated there. The tension shifted. Not louder, just tighter. Rico glanced at the people standing nearby. Some looked away. Some didn't. 4. Chuck's eyes were hidden behind his sunglasses, but their weight was unmistakable. Rico laughed again. "You're nuts, man. You think I care 3. Someone dropped a coffee cup. The sound was small, but it cracked the stillness. 2. Rico puffed out his chest a little. "You gonna lecture me to death?" 1. The moment stretched. Then Chuck moved. It wasn't fast in the way movies show fast. It was fast in the way that the sun disappears behind a cloud. 1 second, it's there. The next, it's gone. Chuck's fist drove forward like it was part of something larger than muscle. Not a punch from anger. Not even from pain. Just clean, clear purpose. It hit Rico square in the chest. The sound was dull and final. Rico's body left the ground in a sudden sharp jolt and crashed into a wooden stall full of canned jam and baskets of apples. The stall collapsed inward. Wood snapped. Jars rolled out like glass marbles on a slanted floor. Apples bounced across the concrete, some bursting. A child gasped. Someone clapped a hand over their mouth. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't look around for approval. He just stood there. Behind him, Max lifted his head. The dog's eyes were wide but calm. He wasn't scared, not anymore. Chuck walked back toward the bench. Slowly, he didn't look down at Rico, who was groaning now, legs tangled in a fallen crate. Chuck crouched by Max again and ran a hand gently down the dog's back. Max shifted, licking Chuck's fingers once. His tail moved just slightly. The townspeople didn't say much. A few whispered, a few recorded with shaking hands. But most just stood there unsure if they'd witnessed justice or prophecy. Chuck reached for Max's collar and checked the fit. His hands were still steady. Behind them, Rico struggled to stand. He pushed himself halfway up on one arm, coughing hard. Chuck didn't look back. He just whispered to Max. He knew the dog wasn't the only one who needed comforting. The whole town had been wounded by what happened. Not physically, but in a way that touched the deeper part of a place like Pine Valley. Because when someone hurts something innocent and acts like it doesn't matter, it shakes something real. Chuck didn't need to explain that. He'd already spoken the 5 words that changed everything. The ones that let everyone know where the line was, and exactly who would stand on it. Rico didn't stay down long. The punch had knocked the wind out of him, maybe some of the pride too, but not the fight. He groaned and rolled onto his side, coughing up air like it had betrayed him. The crowd shifted. Some people backed up a few steps, unsure of what came next. Others leaned in curiosity, outweighing caution. Chuck remained crouched beside Max, running a hand down the dog's back with steady care. He knew the fight wasn't finished. Not with someone like Rico. There were men who stayed down once they understood, and there were others who had to be shown more than once. Rico pulled himself upright, still hunched and staggered toward his motorcycle. He fumbled through the saddlebag and came back with a length of steel chain wrapped around one arm. It clinked as it uncoiled the links heavy and dull under the afternoon sun. The tone changed instantly. The chain swung low at first like a threat being sharpened in midair. Rico cracked his neck and pointed the loose end at Chuck like it was a whip. You think you're something? That was a cheap shot. Chuck stood up, not in a rush, just enough to meet the moment. He turned to the small boy standing nearby, the one holding a lemonade cup, and wide-eyed wonder. Here, hold these. He handed over his sunglasses, and the boy took them without a word, like he'd just been given a medal. Chuck turned back. Rico let the chain swing lazily at his side, his stance-wide shoulders tight. He took a step forward, then another. The chain lifted, rose over his shoulder, and then snapped forward like lightning. Chuck didn't block. He didn't flinch. He moved. His body turned just enough. The chain sliced the air beside his head. As Rico retracted for another swing, Chuck stepped in close, closer than anyone expected, inside the reach of the chain. His left hand grabbed Rico's wrist. His right arm swept up under the elbow and bent it sharply. There was a crack as tension met precision. Rico let out a howl. The chain dropped to the ground. Chuck turned with the motion, pivoting on his foot, and used Rico's own weight to guide him face first toward the nearest bench. Rico caught the edge with his shoulder hard enough to drop him to a knee. Chuck backed away. No flourish, just discipline. Rico staggered back up, fury boiling behind his red shades. He lunged. Chuck shifted his footing. Rico came in with a punch, wild and low. Chuck dipped to the side, caught the punch mid-flight, and twisted Rico's wrist just enough to turn his own arm against him. Then came the strike. A heel tap to the back of Rico's knee. He folded. Chuck didn't wait. He hooked one arm under Rico's chin, leaned slightly, and dropped him backward onto the pavement with a thud. Dust kicked up. Rico's hands scrambled for leverage. Another strike came low this time, an elbow aimed at Chuck's ribs. Chuck shifted again, avoiding it by inches, and delivered a firm palm strike to Rico's chest, pushing him flat. The sound of Rico hitting the ground was final. The town stood still. Rico groaned, once tried to push up, and then dropped again. He blinked, dazed. Blood trickled down from one temple. His sunglasses were gone, knocked somewhere under the bench. Chuck stepped back, breathing even fists loose. He waited, not because he was unsure, but because he gave every man the chance to understand. Sometimes it took longer. Rico blinked again, then closed his eyes. Chuck watched for another second, then nodded to himself. He turned and walked back toward Max, who was sitting up now, alert and wagging his tail slowly. Chuck knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears. "It's okay now." The words were low, meant only for the dog. People around the square were silent, not because they were afraid, not because they didn't know what to say, but because something about what they'd seen didn't need words. It wasn't a bar fight. It wasn't revenge. It was a man who knew how to protect something good and did it without needing to be asked. The boy still held Chuck's sunglasses. He stepped forward, both hands extended like he was returning something sacred. Chuck took them with a nod and slid them on. A woman near the pie stand whispered just loud enough to be heard. Did he even break a sweat? Someone else laughed once nervously. Chuck didn't react. He just stood quiet and composed the wind, catching his flannel shirt as if nature itself was taking a breath again. Behind him, Rico didn't move. He lay in the dust chain, coiled beside him like a lesson waiting to be learned. Chuck didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked down at Max, gave one more slow scratch, and stood again. Order had been restored. Not with rage, not with shouting, just with calm hands, sharp instincts, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits and acts when needed. The sound of sirens came late and slowly. By the time the sheriff's cruiser rolled into the market square, the dust had settled, and the air was almost still again. Rico lay on the ground, not moving much, a shallow breath barely lifting his chest. The chain that once felt threatening now looked like dead weight beside him. A few townsfolk hovered near the apple stand, picking up what they could, their movements quiet, cautious, as if afraid to break whatever spell had fallen across the square. Sheriff Jake Nolan stepped out of the car with one hand resting on his belt, the other shielding his eyes from the sun. He was built like an old football coach, the kind who never raised his voice because he didn't have to. He scanned the scene without asking questions. He didn't need to. He saw the chain, the collapsed stall, the silence in the people, and the way Chuck stood beside Max with the calmness of someone who knew exactly what he'd done. Jake walked over to Rico first. He nudged the man's boot with the toe of his boot. Rico groaned and rolled just enough to show his bruised jaw and bloody temple. He wasn't unconscious, but he was done. Jake didn't speak. He just nodded once, like marking it down in his head. He turned to Chuck. "What happened?" Chuck looked at him, then glanced at Max, who now sat up, fully tail swaying a little, but still wary. Chuck didn't answer right away. He let the moment sit like a man waiting for dust to settle before speaking. "He kicked my dog." Jake looked over at the townspeople. No one contradicted it. A few even nodded. A woman by the honey stand added softly that Rico had done it for no reason. Just walked up and did it. Another said Max never even barked. He was just lying there. Jake looked back at Chuck. And the rest, he pulled a chain. Chuck's voice was even. Tried to use it. Jake looked down again at Rico and let out a long breath. All right. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a small notepad, and made a show of writing something down. Then he looked at the crowd. Anybody else hurt? Nobody spoke. Jake raised his eyebrows slightly. You sure? Still nothing. He closed the notebook with a snap. Sounds like self-defense with a side of pest control. There was a ripple of laughter. Small, cautious, but real. Chuck stepped forward a little. I'll pay for the stand. The apples, whatever's broken. Jake shook his head. We've got a budget for cleanups. What we don't have a budget for is folks like you showing up when we need it most. Chuck didn't smile. He just nodded once. Jake walked over to his cruiser, opened the back door, and motioned toward two deputies who had arrived in a second vehicle. They came forward with handcuffs and gloves, handled Rico gently but firmly. He didn't resist. He muttered something under his breath, but it didn't sound like words anymore. As they lifted him into the car, Jake turned to the crowd. This man is under arrest for animal cruelty, disorderly conduct, and attempted assault with a weapon. He waited a second. And for being dumber than a stump. The laughter came louder this time. It wasn't mocking, it was relief. Chuck knelt again beside Max. The dog leaned into him just a little enough to let Chuck know the pain was fading. Not gone, but manageable. Jake came back over. You all right? Chuck nodded. And the dog. He'll be fine. Good. Jake looked off toward the hills that framed the edge of Pine Valley. A breeze came through soft and pine-sweet like the morning had never been interrupted. Jake let a long pause hang between them. You know, there's a difference between being strong and being right. Chuck looked up. Today, you were both. Chuck stood slow and quiet. I didn't do it for the crowd, I know. They started to walk together slowly, side by side. Max followed, limping slightly, but determined not to be left behind. Jake kicked a broken piece of crate out of the way. You think that guy's coming back, maybe. But not like this. Jake nodded. If he does, I'll be here. But something tells me he's got a bigger shadow behind him. Chuck didn't answer, but the way his jaw set said enough. They reached the edge of the market. People had started cleaning up again. Music hadn't resumed, but conversations had. Slow and soft is the way people speak after something important passes through. Jake patted Chuck's shoulder. Have you ever thought about joining my team? Chuck looked at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. I'm retired. Jake smirked. could have fooled me. Chuck stepped into the cab of his truck. Max hopped up beside him, tail thumping once. As the truck pulled away, the town watched. Not because they didn't know what to do next, but because something inside them had just been realigned. Not by a fight, not by a punch, but by the quiet presence of a man who didn't flinch when wrong showed up loud. And somewhere deep in that stillness there was the quiet echo of something else, something unfinished. The kind of stillness that doesn't stay quiet for long. Chuck knew it. The town felt it. Justice had shown its face today, but shadows don't give up that easily. The county jail in Timbercrest wasn't built to impress or intimidate. It was built to contain and forget. Concrete walls, bad coffee, and the kind of silence that grew heavy after dark. Rico Martez sat in a narrow metal chair hunched over a scratched-up phone booth near the end of the cell block. His face was swollen on one side, bruising dark behind one eye, and his lip was split. The deputy on duty gave him a wide berth. Nobody was interested in being near him right now. Not because they feared him, but because he'd done something so dumb, so senseless it had shaken the whole town. His fingers tapped against the metal shelf under the phone, restless. His free hand held the receiver in a loose grip as he dialed a number from memory. He hesitated for half a breath before pressing the last digit. The line clicked once, then silence. No rings, just open space. Then came the voice. "If you're calling from jail again, you better be bleeding out." Rico winced as he adjusted the receiver against his cheek. "It's bad. You think I don't know that I mean real bad." The guy, he wasn't just some old man. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make Rico shift in his seat. "Chuck Norris," he said. It was Chuck freaking Norris. Another pause. Then there was a sound like someone exhaling through their teeth. Not anger, more like disbelief mixed with something deeper. "You're lucky you're not dead." Rico pressed on, ignoring the chill crawling up the back of his neck. "He laid me out. In front of everyone. Made me look like a clown, like I wasn't even trained. That's because you aren't Rico. I need a way to fix this." The voice didn't respond. "I want to hit back. You already lost. Not with fists. Not again. Something else." The voice stayed quiet, but Rico could almost feel the calculations on the other end. "You sure you want to drag him into something bigger?" "He embarrassed me. He taught you a lesson, and from what I saw, it was one you needed. I didn't ask for a lecture grant." The name dropped like a weight into the conversation. Grant Halverson didn't run a business in the way people ran coffee shops or hardware stores. He ran systems, surveillance, digital fences, private security for billionaires' embassies, and interests no one ever read about in newspapers. Once a commander in an elite special operations unit, Grant had walked away from government work and built his own empire in silence. But before all that, he'd served alongside Chuck, and that history was still there, just below the surface. Grant's voice came back slower now. "Chuck's not like the others. He's not just capable. He remembers what's worth protecting. That makes him harder to beat than you'll ever understand." Rico gripped the edge of the metal table until his knuckles whitened. "So what? You're going to tell me to walk away? I'm telling you to count your blessings. That ain't good enough. It's the only kind of good you've got left." Rico slammed the receiver down and sat there breathing heavily. Across the glass, the deputy watched him like a man watching a dog chew its own leash. The walls of the jail didn't seem so thick anymore. Just quiet. Thin. Like they couldn't hold back what was coming next. 2 days later, Grant sat in a sleek glass office on the top floor of a building no one knew was his. The windows overlooked a river that ran quietly but fast, not unlike the man who stared out at it with folded arms and an expression carved from stillness. He'd spent the last 48 hours reviewing footage, listening to town gossip, and pulling local data from Pine Valley without alerting anyone. He'd seen the moment Rico got punched. Watched it in slow motion. then watched it again. There was nothing fancy about it. No showmanship, just discipline, timing, and something else he hadn't seen in a long time. Restraint. Chuck could have broken the man in two. He didn't. Grant walked to his desk and tapped a small panel built into the surface. A screen lifted from the wood. A map appeared blinking softly with network heat signatures. He spoke to the room without raising his voice. I want a facial from Pine Valley scrubbed. Pull anything tied to Norris's property. Drones, static cams, mail routes. Passive only. A voice responded through an invisible speaker. Understood. Shall I notify assets? Not yet. Just watch. He ended the feed and turned back to the window. His fingers curled into fists not from anger, but from a memory he couldn't shake. Years ago they'd stood side by side on a dirt ridge in another country with no name. Their orders had been unclear. The threat wasn't. Chuck had refused to burn a village for the sake of speed. Grant had disagreed. They hadn't spoken much since. Now, here they were again. One of them is still protecting. One of them is still calculating. That night, back in Pine Valley, a white SUV pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that wound through trees and opened into a wide clearing. It was parked just short of a closed gate with a small wooden sign that read, Private. Beyond the gate was Chuck's land. The place he'd come to retire to, forget to breathe. A man in his 40s stepped out of the SUV dressed too clean for the mountains. He walked to the gate, stood there a moment, then turned back toward the road and left. Nothing in his hands, no photos, no notes, just an observation and intent. Meanwhile, Rico was out on bail, quietly paid for by someone whose name wasn't on the paperwork. He stayed at a cheap motel off Route 7. Curtains drawn, TV off. The phone never answered on the first ring. He paced the carpet until it wore thin beneath his boots. He wrote names on a notepad, then crossed them out. He drank from the sink. He checked the mirror and flinched every time his eye caught the healing bruise. Then he sat on the bed and stared at the wall. Chuck's face kept coming back. Not because of the punch, but because of the stillness that came after. That's what shook him the most. Chuck hadn't gloated, hadn't raised his voice. He had just stood there like he'd seen men like Rico before and didn't need to explain what came next. Rico opened the drawer beside the bed. Inside there was a phone. Prepaid, untraceable, a gift from someone who wanted this to move faster. He dialed another number. I want to talk about information. A pause. Who's the man from Pine Valley? The voice on the other end laughed softly. You sure you want to dig there? Rico said nothing. All right, but don't complain if you find more than you're looking for. By morning, the message had moved across 3 states and landed on a server owned by a subcontractor whose real client had no logo. Within an hour, Chuck's property lines were mapped. His former affiliations flagged. His name ran through databases that weren't supposed to exist. Grant watched the feeds from his office and said nothing. He already knew what Rico was planning, and he already knew it would fail. But he didn't stop it. Part of him wanted to see what would happen when Chuck was tested, not by muscle, but by surveillance distortion and pressure from shadows instead of fists. That was the new battlefield. Information, reputation, manipulation. The kind of fight that doesn't happen in front of a crowd but behind a screen. Chuck didn't live in that world, not by choice. But now, that world was coming for him. And somewhere deep in the silence, Grant felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not guilt, not fear, but a faint, sharp flicker of anticipation. The envelope was there before the sun crested the ridge, just sitting on the porch rail like it had grown out of the wood overnight. No return address, no stamps. Just thick manila, sealed clean and waiting. Chuck spotted it as he opened the screen door with a coffee mug in hand, and Max walking just behind him. The dog paused too, sniffed at the envelope, then looked up at Chuck with that quiet way dogs do when they know something isn't right. Chuck picked it up gently, turned it over once, then twice. The weight told him it wasn't a letter. Not paper, not money, photos maybe. He took it inside, set his mug down without drinking, and opened it with a slow, steady tear. Inside were 4 photographs, one of them in uniform, crouched beside a Blackhawk with 2 other men. Younger faces, dirt-covered smiles, fire in their eyes. The second showed a satellite image of a small hut in a jungle basin. He remembered the mission just by the shape of the tree line. The third was older, faded, a street scene from Kandahar. A moment that shouldn't have been caught but somehow had. He knew who had taken it. The fourth stopped him cold. It was Max. Not a portrait. A still shot blurry and zoomed of Max lying under the oak at the farmer's market. The date in the corner told him it was from the same morning Rico had arrived. At the bottom of the envelope was a card. No signature. Just one word typed in black. Undone. Chuck didn't move for a while. The house was quiet. The ticking of the old wall clock felt louder than usual. Max lay down near the doorway, his head resting on his paws, his eyes watching but calm. There was no fear in the room. Just wait. Chuck laid the photos out on the table, one beside the next, then stood back and looked at them like they were pieces from 2 different lives that had somehow ended up in the same frame. He pulled a wooden chair out from the table and sat. His hand moved to the third photo again, the one from Kandahar. The one that had Grant in the corner was barely visible through the reflection of a window. Grant Halverson. He hadn't heard the name aloud in over a decade, but it never left his mind. Some people fade. Others grow sharper with time, like wounds that never healed quite right. They used to believe in the same things, or at least pretend they did. Back when orders still came with edges and men like them followed with straight backs and full hearts. Chuck remembered Grant as sharp efficient and always thinking 2 steps ahead. But something inside him had turned. It happened quietly, gradual, like a river changing course so slowly you don't notice until the land is gone. There had been a mission. South Sudan. It wasn't on paper, not in the records, but it left a mark. Chuck had made a call to pull the team out. Civilians in the blast zone. Grant had stayed. He'd finished the job. Said it was just math. Fewer problems later. Collateral wasn't a word Chuck ever used again after that. They didn't speak much after. Now, years later, Grant had found him. Not just found, watched, and sent a message. Chuck stared at the word again. Undone. It wasn't a threat. Not directly. It was something deeper. A quiet pull at a loose thread. Not telling him what would happen, but what was already unraveling. The kind of word you use when you know the past hasn't settled. He leaned back in his chair. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. Max shifted ear twitching, sensing the change in air. Chuck stood and walked to the window. The land stretched out golden in the low morning light. Trees swayed without hurry. Nothing in the view gave any clue that something had shifted. But Chuck felt it. Not in fear, not even in anger. Just a recognition. This wasn't about Rico. That boy was just noise. This was about Grant, and something Grant believed he had the right to finish. Chuck rubbed his thumb along the curve of his coffee mug. The warmth was still there, but fading. Outside, a crow called once, sharp and sudden. Max stood and padded over, pressing his side gently against Chuck's leg. The bond between them didn't need words. Chuck reached down, scratched behind Max's ear, and looked again at the porch. No tire marks. No footprints. Whoever left the envelope knew how to move quietly. He walked back to the table, gathered the photos, and slid them into a drawer. He didn't throw them out. Not yet. Not because he needed them, but because they were a signal, a start. He knew what it meant to be hunted, and he knew the difference between noise and warning. This was a warning. Not just that someone was watching, but that someone believed he could still be pushed, still broken. Chuck opened the back door and stepped out into the morning. The air was cold and clean, the kind that filled your chest with just enough sting to remind you you're alive. He walked to the shed, unlocked it, and stepped inside. Tools hung in their place. Nothing was missing. He pulled down a canvas bag from the top shelf. Inside were notebooks, gear things from a life he thought he'd tucked away. He didn't open them. He just stood there for a while, letting the silence fill up the corners of the space. Grant wanted him to know he wasn't alone, that he was being watched, that the life Chuck had chosen, the peace he'd built, was now under quiet siege. Chuck looked down at the dirt beneath his boots and made a decision. He wasn't going to run, and he sure as hell wasn't going to be undone. The trail up to the ridge was quiet, just the way Chuck remembered it. Dirt packed from years of boots, most of them gone now. Pines lined the edge of the hill branches, high enough to let in the light but low enough to hold the hush. Max followed a few steps behind, sniffing now and then, never far. Chuck kept his hands in his pockets as he walked. Not because of the cold, but because they didn't need to be anywhere else. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't restless. But something inside him said it was time to visit the old place again. The one they used to call the quiet house when training runs turned long and sleep was rare. The cabin sat near the tree line, small and square-built for function, not comfort. The front steps creaked like always, soft and slow, like they remembered every boot that ever landed on them. The door wasn't locked. It never had been. Inside, dust floated in the thin rays of light that slipped through cracks in the boards. An old cot leaned against the far wall. The radio was long gone, but the air still held the shape of discipline, of sweat, and of quiet orders followed without hesitation. Chuck stepped in, looked around, and sat on the low bench by the wall. He hadn't been here in years. Not since the last time they ran recon drills for new recruits, before he left it behind. Before Grant stopped pretending. He closed his eyes for a moment. The memory came back sharper than he expected. It was a mission in South Sudan. A contact had gone silent. The locals were uneasy. A village sat between the team and their extraction point. Grant had said they couldn't risk losing the window. Chuck had argued. Not loud, just firm. There were women and kids there. They could find another way. Grant made the call anyway. The airstrike flattened the area in under 3 minutes. The mission succeeded. But Chuck never spoke to Grant the same way again. He remembered the debrief. Grant laid out the decision like it was a chessboard. One move for the many. Sacrifice the few. Efficient. Clinical. Justified. Chuck hadn't said much. He didn't need to. He'd already understood that they were headed in different directions. It wasn't just about tactics. It was about weight. About how much a man was willing to carry for the sake of sleeping at night. Chuck opened his eyes and looked at the wood grain in the bench. Scratches from knives' initials, carved by men who needed to mark something before they vanished. He found one near his knee. Small, deep. It wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder. He stood and walked to the far wall where a steel locker still stood. The key was gone, but he didn't need one. He pressed the top corner just right, and it clicked open like it always had. Inside were a few old supplies. Rope, a worn map. A glass is still half full. He didn't take anything. He just looked. He wasn't here to gear up. He was here to remember. To check the foundation. Grant had moved on. Built something with steel and code and control. Turned principles into procedures and turned men into assets. Chuck had gone the other way. He didn't fight wars anymore, but he still fought for something. For the idea that strength was responsibility, not power. That leadership was what you protected when nobody was watching. That peace wasn't bought. It was earned day by day, choice by choice. He stepped out onto the porch again. Max was sitting at the top of the hill, ears, perked eyes scanning the valley below. The dog didn't bark, didn't move, just watched. Chuck walked up beside him. The view stretched for miles. Trees, rooftops, and the ribbon of the river curling near the edge of town. It looked the same as it always had, but he knew it wasn't. Something had shifted. He felt it in the way the silence pressed at his back, the way the wind paused between the trees. Grant wasn't just watching, he was testing, not with force, not yet, but with the quiet tools that wear you down from the inside. That bends the truth until good men start to doubt their own footing. Chuck wasn't going to let that happen. Not to him. Not to this town. He reached down, patted Max on the head, and let the air fill his lungs slowly and fully. It didn't hurt to remember. It only hurts when you forget why you started. They met behind the community center on a Sunday morning just after sunrise. The grass was damp, the air soft with that early stillness before the day finds its rhythm. There were about a dozen of them. Men and women all over 60, most retired. All with stories tucked behind their eyes. Chuck stood in the center of the field, hands at his sides. He didn't wear anything fancy. Just boots of faded flannel and quiet authority. Max sat near the picnic bench tail curled around his side watching without blinking. Chuck didn't start with words. He just walked over to the group and nodded once. They stepped closer without being told. They were here not for spectacle, but because they sensed something had changed, and because they trusted him. He began with a breath. Inhale steadily. Exhale through the nose. Hands loose at the waist, shoulders down. He didn't explain it as an exercise, he explained it as presence. When you walk into a room, he said, walk like you mean to stay. Then came balance. How to ground your weight without tension. How to turn your body instead of stiffening it. He moved slowly, showing each motion twice. He didn't talk about attackers or enemies. He talked about posture, about awareness, about not giving fear a place to sit. He paired them off, had them mirror each other. Palms to palms, just pressure and resistance. No force, just listening, through the hands. One man smiled softly when he realized how quickly his wife could shift her stance and move him back a step. Chuck said strength isn't always louder than fear, but it lasts longer. He told them about a night in another country when no one else stepped up. So he did, and not because he was brave, but because he couldn't stand still. They nodded, not because they had seen war, but because they had raised children. Buried loved ones held their homes together through things no one ever put in the news. They knew what it meant to hold the line quietly. Chuck showed them how to deflect a wrist grab. Not to fight, just to break contact and step away. One woman, lean and silver-haired, tried it once. Then again, and smiled when it worked better the second time. You don't need to be faster, Chuck said. You just need to be certain. After an hour, he had them circle up. He didn't give a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke with that low steadiness that made people lean in without knowing they were doing it. Peace is not what happens when nobody fights. It's what happens when good people stay ready. They stood with him in silence for a long moment. The wind picked up through the trees. Max barked once. Chuck looked down at him, then back at the group. They all understood. This wasn't about defending the town with fists. It was about reminding each other that age doesn't erase courage. That growing older doesn't mean growing softer. That dignity isn't something you inherit. It's something you carry one decision at a time. As the group walked back toward the parking lot, Chuck stayed behind. He watched them move with shoulders straighter than before, eyes steadier. Not transformed, just reminded. He walked back toward Max and knelt to scratch behind his ears. We've still got work to do, buddy. The dog leaned into his hand. The breeze cooled as the sun lifted higher. Chuck looked out over the valley where peace still held, not because it was untouched, but because someone had chosen to protect it, quietly, every day. It started with the hum of a van rolling in past midnight. No headlights, no logos, just a dull white vehicle moving slowly down Pine Valley's back streets. Inside were 4 men dressed like utility workers, reflective vests, tool belts. Each carried equipment that didn't belong to the power lines or cables: laptops, signal jammers, portable hard drives. Their orders were clear: quiet entry, no damage, no noise, just data. Grant didn't want chaos. He wanted information. Faces logs, camera feeds, the kind of digital thread that could unspool a town if pulled hard enough. He figured Pine Valley would be soft, comfortable, a place where people slept deeply and locked nothing. What he didn't count on was Chuck. Chuck had been watching the substation all week, not out of paranoia, but instinct. There had been a new face near the transformer box 3 nights ago. Gloves, no name tag, too clean. The timing didn't sit right. He started paying closer attention. Motion sensors had been hidden in flower beds, trail cams perched on old birdhouses. At night, he walked the edge of the town with Max acting like any man walking his dog. But every fence line, every alley was a memory to him, and each one got mapped again in his head. The operatives split up once the van stopped. 2 moved north toward the old bookstore. The other 2 headed toward Maple Street, where most homes had some kind of smart camera. They worked fast, jammed signals, bypassed routers. Didn't break anything, just slipped past locks like fog through a window crack. But every house they entered had something odd: a motion light that clicked on too fast, a clock that was off by 4 minutes, a dog that barked once, then sat, quiet like it had been trained to wait for a signal. The first operative got caught by a tripwire made from fishing line and a bell. He hit the ground hard and rolled expecting gunfire. Nothing came, just silence and the thud of a small sandbag from above. By the time he stood up, his hands were zip-tied. The second found himself caught in a shed. The door had looked jammed. When he pulled it open, it triggered a spring-loaded net that dropped from the rafters. He tried to cut through, but his knife was gone. Taken, he realized, from his belt just moments before. Chuck moved like memory. Not fast, not loud, just precise. He never used force when friction would do. He never shouted when stillness worked better. At 2:13 a.m., the last 2 operatives entered the church office by the school. They bypassed the door sensor and stepped inside. They didn't notice the pressure mat beneath the rug, the one Chuck had built in a cabin 30 years ago. It sent a signal to a pager in his coat pocket. He didn't run, he just walked. Max is beside him, steady. Inside the church, the operatives were already pulling data from the office Wi-Fi when the power blinked out. Not citywide, just the church, just long enough to send them scrambling. When the backup light came on, Chuck was already inside. He didn't strike, he didn't yell, he just spoke. You boys lost, they froze. The taller one reached for something in his vest. Chuck shook his head once. The motion was enough. I'd think twice, he said. This town's not what you think. They tried anyway. It didn't take long. A twist, a sweep, and both were down. Not injured, just disarmed, immobilized, controlled. By the time the sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, all 4 men were seated at separate locations around town, each zip-tied, each unharmed. Each had a handwritten note tucked into their shirt pocket. This town protects its own. Sheriff Nolan didn't ask questions. He just looked at Chuck, then looked at the notes. You did this. Chuck nodded once. Nolan scratched his head, glanced at one of the laptops, then whistled low. Do they know who you are? Chuck didn't answer right away. They know enough, he said. Nolan radioed for backup. Quiet. No sirens, just calm voices and early dawn light. The sun rose over Pine Valley without a sound. People woke, made coffee, and stepped outside to greet the day without knowing what had passed while they slept. Chuck stood near the edge of town, one hand resting on Max's back. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He was just sure. That peace, real peace, only lived where someone was willing to defend it without becoming what it feared. He looked out across the rooftops and listened to the quiet. It was still holding. For now. Chuck left Pine Valley before the sun was up. The highway stretched quietly under his tires' headlights, carving long shadows between trees and open fields. He didn't bring a weapon. He didn't need one. The weight in his chest was enough. Grant's residence wasn't marked on any map, but Chuck knew the road. Gravel turned to pavement, then wound through a tall iron gate that opened without being asked. Cameras blinked in the trees. Sensors tracked every movement. The place was clean, precise, cold. He parked without hurry. Max stayed behind quiet in the truck bed, watching the glass and steel building that rose like a bunker in the woods. Chuck walked to the front door where it opened before he could knock. Grant stood there dressed like a man who never aged. Tailored shirt, clean lines, no visible weapon. His face didn't change when he saw Chuck. Just a slow nod. Almost like a welcome. Almost. They didn't shake hands. Chuck followed him inside, boots clicking softly on polished floors. No guards. No servants. Just silence that echoed with control. They sat across from each other in a wide room with no clutter. One wall was glass looking out over a reflection pool. The other was lined with screens that weren't on. Grant leaned back, fingertips pressed together. "You could have sent a message," he said. "I did," Chuck answered. Grant studied him for a moment. They sat there, two men shaped by the same years, the same war zones, the same codes. But time had carved different paths in each of them. Where Chuck carried stillness, Grant carried sharpness, like he was always calculating. You protected a dog. "A town," cute Grant said. Chuck didn't blink. "I protected something you forgot existed." Grant smiled thinly without warmth. "We're past flags and feelings. What matters now is stability, information, control." Chuck leaned forward slightly. Stability bought with silence isn't peace. Grant's eyes narrowed. "You really believe that in a world this fractured, I believe people are worth more than numbers." Chuck's voice was calm, like gravel under snow. "You ran with me long enough to know that." Grant stood and walked to the window. The glass reflected his face like a stranger's. "The mission was always bigger than us. We just stopped pretending otherwise." Chuck remained seated. "No, you stopped believing people mattered more than systems." Grant turned, his voice tightening. "I built something that works. No chaos, no guesswork. The world's safer when I know who's watching." Chuck looked at him steady. "And who watches you?" The room went quiet. The reflection pool outside rippled once as if the wind had finally remembered its way back in. Grant walked back slower this time. "You came to warn me, I came to look you in the eye. And I see a man who forgot why we started." Chuck stood. Legacy isn't about control. It's what you leave in others. What stays behind when you're gone. Grant didn't answer. Chuck stepped to the door, paused, and turned. "You're smart, Grant. You know how this ends if you keep pushing." Grant looked at him, no emotion showing. "Then we'll see how much your principles hold when the rest of the world moves past them." Chuck nodded once. "Maybe they will, but I'll still be standing." He stepped outside. The door closed behind him without a sound. Max sat up as he approached tail, tapping the bed of the truck. Chuck didn't say a word. He just climbed in, started the engine, and drove. Behind him, Grant stood at the window, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. Neither man won. But something had shifted, and both of them knew it. Grant's message came from a courier just after sunrise. A small envelope was opened and sealed tightly. Inside was a card, thick paper with a single line typed in the center. One more conversation. Your move. Chuck read it once, then placed it on the kitchen counter next to his coffee. Max lay by the doortail, still ears up. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you listen harder. He drove into town by mid-morning. No rush. He knew the meeting place without being told. The top floor of the old bank building. Renovated now, polished. Grant waited in a black suit, leaning against the window with a view that stretched over Pine Valley's rooftops and hills. He offered a handshake. Chuck nodded, but didn't take it. Grant motioned to a chair. Chuck stayed standing. The pitch was simple. Walk away, relocate. Somewhere quiet, out of sight. In return, Pine Valley would receive resources, technology upgrades, security infrastructure. A town grant that would fund every business and school for the next decade. Grant said it like it was charity. Chuck heard it like it was surrender. He let the silence fill the room before he answered. You still don't get it. Grant arched a brow. This town doesn't want your version of safety, not if it comes with a price. Grant didn't flinch. He called it a partnership. Chuck called it control. They stood inches apart. One man built from circuits and strategy, the other from time and truth. Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He just said no, clearly, fully, without pause. Grant didn't press. He only nodded once, like he'd expected it, but his eyes told a different story. Chuck left the building without looking back. That evening, as the sun folded into the hills, unmarked vehicles began parking along the town's edge. Men in suits, laptops were opened inside black sedans, quiet movements, no guns, data probes and signals are meant to sweep through every Wi-Fi router and security feed in range. But nothing connected. Every network had been reset. Every router was replaced with new hardware donated by local businesses. The bookstore owner had pulled her power line entirely. The barber installed a signal scrambler under his counter. And every camera in town, from doorbells to traffic posts, had been disabled for maintenance just hours before. It wasn't sabotage. It was preparedness. Every change had been filed properly. Every device swap is logged and signed by the town council. By 9 p.m., Grant's surveillance team had no access, no signal, no way in. At 9:15, the sheriff's truck pulled up beside one of the sedans parked near the library. Sheriff Nolan stepped out. No backup, just his hat, his clipboard, and a small metal badge that caught the last of the sunlight. He tapped on the window. The man inside rolled it down. "Evening," the sheriff said. "Got a town ordinance here about outside monitoring activity. You boys have a permit." The agent didn't answer. Sheriff Nolan waited a beat, then smiled gently. Didn't think so. Behind him, townspeople began to gather on the sidewalks. Not in protest, just presence. Quiet, calm presence. Eyes watching, arms crossed. Faces that said, "We know what this is and we're not afraid of it." The sheriff handed over a copy of the ordinance. Violation of privacy. Unauthorized surveillance, trespass. Nothing dramatic. Just the law. Applied with precision. By 10 p.m., the cars were gone. No one shouted. No one chased. They were just gone. Chuck sat on his porch with Max that night, sipping warm coffee, watching the stars come out one by one. The town had spoken, not with fists, not with speeches, just with a choice. A line drawn not in sand, but in dignity. We take care of our own, and this time the world would have to learn how to take no for an answer. 1 year passed like a quiet wind through the pines. Pine Valley, still tucked in its fold of hills, looked much the same from the outside. But inside, something had settled deeper, stronger. The town now moved with a kind of quiet confidence, as if everyone had remembered who they were and who they stood beside. It started small. A bench replaced near the market had a brass plate that read, "For those who protect with kindness." Max's paw print had been pressed into the cement beside it before it dried. No fanfare, just a mark that said something happened here and it mattered. Each spring the town held a small celebration. No parade, just stories and music and tables lined with homemade food. People wore shirts that read, "Kindness is strength." Some had Chuck's silhouette mid-stance. Most didn't. The point wasn't the man, it was what he stood for. Max always got the loudest cheers when he trotted into the square with his tail up and eyes bright. He was older now, moved slower, but he still greeted every child with the same soft nudge and every visitor with patient trust. Chuck stayed the same. He still lived just outside town, on the same piece of land with the wide porch and the rocking chair that creaked a little more each season. He split wood, fed birds, walked the trails with Max before sunrise. He talked less now, which was saying something. The town didn't treat him like a hero. They treated him like a neighbor, which was exactly how he liked it. That morning, the sky was soft and gray. Clouds passed slowly. The breeze smelled of pine and warm dirt. Chuck was working in the shed when the knock came. Light. Polite. No urgency. He wiped his hands and stepped outside to find a young man waiting no older than 30 with a satchel over one shoulder and a notebook in hand. The kid smiled like someone who'd practiced. Said he was a journalist. Said he wanted to write a story about what happened, about Chuck, about the town, about how one man's choice echoed wider than anyone expected. Chuck listened, nodded once, then said no. The kid blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. Chuck stepped past him and poured water into Max's bowl. Said the story didn't belong to him. It belonged to the people who stepped forward when it counted. The sheriff who stood tall, the grocer who cut the signal, the old men and women who trained quietly in the park. He wasn't the point, just a man who remembered what right looked like. The kid thanked him, said he understood. Chuck offered him coffee. They sat for a while and watched the wind move through the trees. Nothing more. Later, as the sky deepened into late afternoon, Chuck packed a small canvas bag with jerky and water. Max stood by the door before Chuck even called. They walked toward the hills, the path familiar, but still full of quiet mystery. The trees opened like they always had. The trail curved the same way it had for 50 years. As they moved farther into the woods, the sounds of the town faded, replaced by birdsong, the rustle of squirrels, the rhythm of boots on packed earth. Chuck paused now and then to let Max sniff something old, a fallen log, a worn patch of moss. Every step forward was earned, not hurried. He thought about how many people forget peace isn't something you win once. It's something you choose, over and over, quietly, when no one's looking. They reached the overlook just before sunset. The valley stretched wide and golden beneath the sky. Homes dotted the hillsides. Lights flicked on one by one like stars remembering themselves. Max sat beside him, tail still. Chuck lowered himself to the old bench they'd hauled up here years ago. He ran a hand down Max's back and let the silence sit. It wasn't heavy, just full. There would always be more trouble out there, more men like Grant, more temptations to trade principle for comfort. But tonight, this patch of earth was steady, held by people who stood together, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Chuck leaned back and let the quiet settle. He didn't need a statue, didn't want a headline. He had Max, the trees, the town, and that was enough. The stars came out slowly, and Pine Valley slept. Safely, softly, because one man once stood still when others turned away, and because quiet men, when they finally speak, can change everything.